Okay, I want to go through our very last piece of information on evolution that will allow you to be successful on our project for our ecology evolution combo here. So, we're going to talk about the origin of species, aka speciation. We're going to focus on a quick review here of micro and macro evolution. We'll talk about what the biological species concept is and why that's used. Most of the time for identifying speciation. We'll talk about prezygotic, postzygotic barriers that will be related to reproductive isolation. And then we'll talk about allopatric sympatric speciation and how that leads to some similar and different speciation concepts. So, again, a reminder we talked about microevolution a lot more because before when we were talking about Hardy Weinberg, because that had to deal with allelic frequencies and changes to a single gene pool. And where our macroevolution is going to be above the species level, and then it's going to have some accumulation for a species over longer periods of time. So an example of that macroevolution could refer to something like those appearance of feathers or feather patterns like we're seeing with the birds that I have below there. There are a couple different types of species concepts out there that scientists use to define how species occur and why they occur. Oops, sorry. Get me back. There we go. But the main one that is used across the board for species concepts is called the biological species concept, which basically says that a population or a group of populations are considered to be a species when they can interbreed and they can produce viable, fertile offspring. There is a genetic species concept, which has to deal with again, the genetic sequences, and that's how species are related to each other based off of the similarity and differences. So some people argue that's how species should be defined. And then there's another one which has to deal with reproductive species concept and whether or not it's like a physical piece that is related to how species are made. So, but this one, biological species concept, is the main one that is used by scientists. Okay. So, in order to produce offspring that can also interbreed and be successful and fertile that way, we're going to focus on, what might prevent that ability, and those are going to be called reproductive isolation barriers. And so when you do your project, you are creating your own species, and one of the evolution descriptions is asking you to identify how did your species come to be. So what reproductive barriers were there that caused maybe your species to separate out from something else. So that's what we'll be looking at. Here we go. So there's two types of reproductive barriers. Prezygotic barriers has to deal with preventing mating or hindering actual fertilization. And then postzygotic barriers are going to be associated to the fact that that fertilized egg is going to be prevented from developing into a fertile adult. So you might have some hybrids that are formed, but are not really viable or don't survive very long, or it could prevent even just general hybrid production. So that's pre and post zygotic barriers. And so you can see there's 5 prezygotic barriers that are going to prevent mating or hinder fertilization, which I'll go through next. So habitat, temporal, behavioral, mechanical, and gametic. And just knowing those 5 terms to begin with, you probably already have an idea of what they're preventing. So here we go. I'll talk about the postzygotics in a moment too. Here's a visual of all of those. Again, prezygotic on the left is related to the fact that it's going to prevent mating or hindering fertilization. Okay. So the first one is habitat isolation. That is two species living in the same geographic area, but not in the same habitat. So if they're not in the same habitat, that's going to prevent them from mating to begin with. Temporal isolation is the next one. And that's going to deal with species that may breed at different times of the day or during different seasons or different times of the year. So that prevents their mating. Behavioral isolation has to deal with signals or mating patterns or habits that attract different mates. These signals are going to be unique to their species. So other species may not respond to those signals or those mating dancers that you might see. Therefore, mating does not occur. Right? Those three are kind of linked together, referring to the prevention of mating. The next two are going to be focused on hindering fertilization. So mechanical isolation is going to be more of the anatomy, anatomical structure piece, that there's some incompatibility between the physical structures where they can't create where no fertilization can happen, right? Size, shape, that sort of thing, they just aren't compatible. And gametic isolation is going to be, even though, even if the gametes meet between these two species, they are unable to fuse and create a zygote. So that would be gametic isolation. Gametes can meet, but they can't fuse together. Mechanical isolation, is the anatomical structures don't quite fit together. And then the last part over there is the visual of our postzygotic barriers, which has to deal with hybrid vitality and viability. So the first one is reduced viability. They can create a hybrid, but it may not last very long, or it may not live very long because there are some issues there. Reduced hybrid fertility, those three organisms or species in the middle, we have, like zorses, a combination of a zebra and a horse, our mules, our ligers. Those are possible hybrids. But then when those hybrids try to reproduce, they are not successful. And then hybrid breakdown, or sorry, I just mixed my last two together. The mule, the zorse, the liger, those are going to be sterile offspring, hybrid offspring that are created. And then hybrid breakdown is successful hybrid offspring that are produced, but when those hybrids try to reproduce, their offspring are not fertile. So again, this is going to repeat what I did, just going to give you a zoomed in version of each of those. Habitat isolation, same geographic location, just not the same habitat, so they can't produce. Temporal isolation, wrong time of day, wrong season, wrong year. They are not able to reproduce. Behavioral isolation, right? Their mating habits, their signals that they send out are not received or well received by other mates, so they cannot reproduce. These two are focused again on the fertilization piece. Mechanical, physically cannot interact with each other for their reproductive patterns. Gametic isolation, even if their gametes meet, they don't fertilize. And then these are our postzygotic barriers. And so I'm just going to jump through that. There are two main modes of speciation, which you could also identify and explain in your evolution description of your species that you create. There's the original population up top, and then there's two main modes of speciation that could come to lead to new species. So the first one, allopatric, is going to deal with a geographic separation um, between the two species. So some sort of geographic isolation between the parent population that causes, new species to occur. And then sympatric speciation is going to be there isn't a geographic barrier um, that separates it out, but some sort of genetic component that causes them to want to switch to a new habitat, maybe to a new food source, maybe a different um, mating ritual is interesting to them, and it has to deal with the genetic component, actually. So here we go. We call those homelands, and so allopatric means it's going to another homeland, and sympatric, they are together in the same homeland or um, within the same geographic location, but are separate from each other. So, allopatric speciation, really common examples. The Grand Canyon, that is a physical, geographic isolating mechanism that causes different species to occur, right? So, we maybe had a parent population of squirrels originally. Grand Canyon is formed. We have these north and south rims of the Grand Canyon, so we have these north and south populations of a squirrel. Same thing with like a mountain range that's forming, or maybe, a river that eventually gets formed. Those are going to be some geographic isolating speciation processes. Okay. And this can lead to some connections between natural selection and genetic drift as well. Sympatric, when they're together in the same geographic location, typically there is an issue with some sort of gene flow, which has to deal with genetic components. So polyploidy is going to be a process that occurs in animals and plants as well. It can occur in animals. It's not as common, more common in plants, sorry. But that is where the population might switch again to a new habitat, food source, or some other source like reproductive process. But it's going to have to deal with, the improper separation of chromosomes. And so I'm going to give you a little visual on that next. Hopefully I did that. Oh, there's my Grand Canyon example. So autoploid deals with extra sets of chromosomes that just improperly separate from each other. So instead of going from our diploid organism and allowing that same cell division process to occur, there's improper division, and you end up with, double the amount of chromosomes that you had. So there is improper chromosome combinations, and therefore that chromosome issue leads to some different signals that are sent, and therefore that species no longer wants to be in that habitat or no longer wants to reproduce with its mates like it normally did. So that would lead to some polyploidy pieces. So some strawberry examples for you that can be incredible examples of autoploidy or polyploidy. So again, it's common in plants, less common in animals, but it can occur. So there's another example of what happens when they're reproducing or they're creating their hybrid offspring piece. Excuse me. And then sometimes there are incomplete reproductive barriers where, again, California is a good example of this because they have mountain ranges or, limited rivers, but there are some that are going to go through and cause these barriers, these geographic barriers, and gene flow pieces where we might have two species forming that separate across California, between the eastern and western sides of California. And then there's this hybrid zone where maybe that physical barrier disappears for a moment. So then those two species can meet and reproduce. And that's where these hybrids are occurring, where they could be viable, they may not be viable, or once those hybrids try to reproduce, their offspring are no longer viable. And so that's what the hybrid zone is. You might also see these species at the end of their circles or their zones when those two new species meet, that they might actually go back and reverse back and have the possibility to reproduce successfully, which is really, really interesting. So I just wanted to touch on that. Other examples of those hybrids besides the Zorse, the ligers that we talked about, grizzly and polar bear. Okay, so that covers all that information